Schmale moves that the House declare non-confidence in the Prime Minister and his costly government for increasing the carbon tax 23% on April 1st, as part of a plan to quadruple the tax while Canadians cannot afford to eat, heat and house themselves, and call for the House to be dissolved so Canadians can vote in a carbon tax election. If a member participating in person wishes the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I ask them to rise and indicate to the Chair. The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
Thank you. I would request a recorded vote, Mr. Speaker.
The members.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
I'll move that the House declare non-confidence in the Prime Minister and his costly government for increasing the carbon tax 20% on April 1st as part of his plan to quadruple the tax while Canadians cannot afford to eat, heat and house themselves, and call for the House to be dissolved so Canadians can vote in the carbon tax election. La période de 10 minutes pour le
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Knish.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Paulus.
Miss Landsman.
Ms. Landsman.
Mr. Halland.
Mr. Halland.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Hobart.
Mr. Hobart.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas South Gary.
Mr. Duncan Stormadanga South-Gary.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Miss Finley.
Miss Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mr. Abouteif.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Miss Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. McCauley and Minton West.
Mr. McCall West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodrich.
Mrs. Goodrich.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Madame Bien.
Madame Pien.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Mullilo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Miss Rude.
Miss Rude.
Monsieur Leroux.
Monsieur Leroux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Kurek.
Mr. Kurek.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Crown.
Mr. Crown.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Doddle.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
All those opposed? I want to remind members it's hard for the clerks to be able to hear the names that are being called, so if members could please keep it down a bit. All those opposed to the motion will please rise. Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Miss Anand.
Ms. Anand.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Mr. Guilbeault.
Miss Hutchings.
Miss Hutchings.
Miss Tassi.
Miss Tassi.
Mr. Barani.
Mr. Varani.
Miss Chagger.
Miss Chager.
Miss Groh.
Miss Grove.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Miss Cara.
Miss Cara.
Mr. Miller.
Monsieur Miller.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Madame Pitspataylor.
Madame Putzpataylor.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Madame Martinez Ferrada.
Madame Martinez Ferrada.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Fragascados.
Mr. Fragascados.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Vancouverdin.
Mr. Vancouverdin.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Miss Dillon.
Miss Dillon.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Dogood.
Mr. Duga.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Miss Vandenberg.
Ms. Vandenberg.
Mr. Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Miss Hupner.
Miss Hefner.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Miss Yip.
Miss Yip.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Miss Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Miss Taylor-Roy.
Miss Taylor-Roy.
Miss Thompson.
Miss Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Champoux.
Madame Saint-Clair de Gagné.
Madame Sinclair de Gagné.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Savard, pardon, Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca.
Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Désilet.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Miss Blaney.
Miss Blaney.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Canning.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Miss May Sanish Gulf Islands.
Miss May Sanish Gulf Islands.
La Chambre attendrait maintenant.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Order. I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended.
Technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them. Or they can rise in this House to be recognized. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 116, 116. Nays contre 204, 204.